My name is Dana Whitlock. I'm 33 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I saw a text message I was never supposed to see, sent to the wrong thread by my own mother, that read, "We can't have the lowly single mom thing at the party, it'll bring the whole mood down. Just don't invite her this time." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, the way I had to. Lowly single mom. Not Dana, not your granddaughter's mother, just a category, flattened down into two dismissive words, sent to a group chat that was clearly meant for someone else, about her own 60th birthday party, referring to me and my 8-year-old daughter as a problem to be managed rather than family to be included. I read it standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, the same way I've read a lot of hard things over the years, standing very still, waiting to see what my body would do before my mind caught up. The kitchen clock ticked in the background, the same clock that's hung on that wall since we moved in 4 years ago, and somewhere down the hall, I could hear Mia humming to herself, while she colored at the dining table, completely unaware that the ground under our whole relationship with her grandmother had just shifted without her knowing it. I didn't cry right away. I read it 3 more times, actually, half convinced I'd misunderstood the context, that maybe this was about someone else entirely, some other single mother in some other conversation I wasn't part of. It wasn't. My daughter's school pickup time was mentioned 2 messages later in the same thread. There was no ambiguity left after that. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, the channel where ordinary people meet the moment that changes everything, and choose facts over noise, every single time. If you've ever been reduced to a label by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me you're here, and stay with me until the very end, because what actually happened after that message, and what it revealed about my entire family, is far bigger and far more complicated than a single cruel sentence in a group chat. Let me back up, because you need the years before that message to understand exactly how much weight it was carrying. I became a single mother 8 years ago, under circumstances my family has never fully understood, largely because I never corrected the story they built in their own heads about it. My daughter's father, a man named Eric, died in a car accident 4 months before she was born. We weren't married yet, though we'd been together for 3 years and had every intention of getting there eventually, once we'd both finished the specific financial and career milestones we'd quietly agreed mattered to us. We used to joke that we were practically married already, since he'd moved his things into my apartment a year earlier, and had started coming to family dinners often enough that my own mother had, at the time, seemed genuinely fond of him, complimenting his manners, asking him detailed questions about his job at a logistics company, the ordinary warmth of a mother getting to know the man her daughter planned to build a life with. I was 6 months pregnant when the accident happened. A rainy Tuesday evening. I still can't drive past a certain intersection without feeling my chest tighten slightly, even 8 years later. In the disorienting, grief-soaked months that followed, when people at my mother's church, at family gatherings, at the grocery store even, assumed I'd simply been left behind by an irresponsible man who'd skipped out on his responsibilities, I found it easier, in the specific numb way grief makes almost everything easier, to just let pass, to not correct them. It required less of me, in those early months, to let people believe the uglier, simpler story than to explain, over and over, that the man I loved had died before he ever got the chance to become the father he was preparing to be. My mother, Carol Ann, absorbed that same uncorrected version of events along with everyone else, and over 8 years, it calcified into a specific narrative she's told at church functions and family gatherings more times than I can count. That her daughter got herself into a difficult situation with an unreliable man, and to her credit, is doing an admirable job managing the consequences alone. I let that story stand for years, partly out of the same grief-driven avoidance that let it take root in the first place, partly because correcting it, this many years in, started to feel like reopening a wound I'd worked hard to let scar over. I understand now, looking back, that my own silence played a real role in how this story unfolded, and I don't say that to excuse what came next. I say it because I think the truest version of this has to include the part where I wasn't simply a blameless bystander in my own family's misunderstanding of me. My daughter, Mia, is 8 years old, sharp and observant in the specific way kids, raised primarily by one attentive parent, often are. And she has grown up on the edges of my mother's affection in a way that took me embarrassingly long to fully see clearly. Invited to some gatherings, quietly left off others. Given gifts that always seemed slightly smaller, slightly less considered, than the ones given to my sister's kids. A Barbie doll still in its original clearance sticker one Christmas, while my nephew unwrapped a gaming console the same afternoon. Nothing dramatic enough, on any single occasion, to point to and say definitively, here, this was cruelty. Just a slow accumulation of smaller signals that I'd spent years explaining away, the same way I'd explained away Carol Ann's specific brand of quiet, respectable disapproval for most of my adult life, telling myself she just wasn't naturally demonstrative, that she loved in her own reserved way, that I was perhaps being too sensitive about small things that didn't actually mean anything. The message I saw 3 weeks ago wasn't, it turned out, an isolated slip. Once I started asking careful, quiet questions of a few cousins I trusted, I learned there was an entire separate group chat, one I'd never been added to, that had existed for over a year, used specifically for planning family events, and apparently, discussing them candidly in ways nobody wanted me to see. My cousin Ashley admitted this to me first, uncomfortably, over coffee, telling me that comments about my situation, my circumstances, as she put it delicately, had come up more than once in that chat over the past year. Always framed as concern, always carrying an undertone that made clear my presence at certain events was considered, at minimum, a complication to be managed. Here's where the story took a turn I genuinely did not see coming. I work as a project coordinator for a hospitality group that manages event bookings and private dining reservations across a regional network of restaurants. The fairly unglamorous job most days. Spreadsheets and vendor calls and conflict resolution between clients and venues. The private dining room my mother had booked for her 60th birthday party, the party I'd just learned I wasn't invited to, turned out to be inside a restaurant under my own company's regional management contract. I hadn't booked it. I didn't even know about it until I happened to be reviewing that week's reservation list for an entirely unrelated scheduling reason, and saw my mother's name attached to a private event 3 weeks out. I want to be honest about what I felt seeing that. It wasn't triumph, not at first. It was a strange, disorienting kind of vertigo, the same way you feel when two completely separate parts of your life suddenly, unexpectedly overlap. I sat at my desk for a long moment before clicking into the reservation details any further, half wondering if I even had the right to look, even though it fell well within my normal job responsibilities to review it. What I found when I did look further genuinely stopped me. The deposit for the party hadn't been paid by my mother at all. It had been paid from a card I recognized instantly, because I'd seen the last 4 digits of it on birthday cards for years. It was my father's. My parents divorced 11 years ago, an amicable enough split as these things go, though it left my father in the specific position of still being financially entangled with my mother's life in small, ongoing ways neither of them ever fully untangled. Alimony technically ended years ago, but old habits, old financial gestures, apparently hadn't. I called him that same evening, expecting, honestly, that he probably already knew the full guest list, that this might be one more thing he'd simply gone along with the way he tends to go along with most things involving my mother, avoiding conflict wherever avoidance is available to him. He didn't know. I had to be the one to tell him, sitting on my back porch with the phone pressed to my ear, watching Mia do cartwheels across the yard in the fading evening light, that the party he was quietly funding had specifically excluded his own granddaughter, and that the excuse given for it was a phrase I still couldn't say out loud without my voice catching. I read him the message, word for word, and there was a long silence on the line afterward, long enough that I asked if he was still there. She asked me for help with the deposit and told me it was just going to be a small gathering with some of her old friends. He finally said, his voice slower than usual, the way it gets when he's genuinely turning something over rather than reaching for a quick answer. I didn't ask for a guest list. I just wrote the check. He was quiet again for a moment, and then he added, almost to himself, I should have asked more questions. I always just write the check. I believed him. My father has never been a man who asks enough questions about anything, but I've never known him to be cruel on purpose either, and this felt, distinctly, like the specific harm of someone who simply hadn't thought to ask, rather than someone who'd have said yes even if he had. Mia finished her last cartwheel and flopped dramatically onto the grass, calling out to ask if Grandpa said hi, and I told her he did, because in that moment, it felt like the kindest true thing I could offer her. The next piece of this came from my Aunt Denise, my mother's younger sister, who has always had a slightly looser relationship with discretion than the rest of the family, in the best possible way. Over a phone call I'd initiated mostly to vent, she let slip something that reframed the entire situation for me. My mother had been specifically anxious about a particular group of women attending this party, old friends from her country club circle from decades ago, women she hadn't seen regularly in years and clearly still wanted to impress. According to Denise, Carolyn had said, more than once in recent months, that she didn't want to have to explain the whole situation with Mia's father to that specific crowd, people who'd known my mother back when appearances mattered enormously to her, and apparently, in some corner of her mind, still did. That detail didn't make the original message hurt less. If anything, it made it hurt in a different, quieter way. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated social management. My daughter and I recast as a liability to be minimized in front of an audience my mother wanted to impress, a decision that had nothing to do with who Mia actually was and everything to do with a story about our family that Carol and had never bothered to correct, or even fully examine. Around this same time, I learned something about Mia herself that I hadn't known, and it's the part of this whole ordeal that still catches in my throat the most. She'd overheard a phone call weeks earlier, one of mine, apparently, where I'd been venting quietly to a friend about my mother's behavior, thinking Mia was occupied with a show in the next room. She hadn't been. She'd been sitting on the stairs, listening, and had apparently been quietly turning over a question in her head for weeks that she finally asked me one evening while I was tucking her into bed, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm the way it's been every night since she was 3. Why doesn't Grandma like our family? She asked, not upset exactly, just genuinely curious, in the specific matter-of-fact way kids ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. I sat down on the edge of her bed and asked her what made her think that, buying myself a few seconds to figure out how to answer honestly without frightening her. She said, simply, you sounded sad on the phone, and you said Grandma's party, and then you said my name, and then you sounded sadder. 8 years old, and she'd assembled the emotional shape of the situation from 3 overheard sentences, and my tone of voice, more perceptive than most adults I know. I didn't have a clean answer for her that night. I told her Grandma loved her, which felt true and incomplete at the same time, and I sat with her until she fell asleep, and lay awake long after in my own bed thinking about how long she might have been carrying that question alone before she finally asked it out loud. It was around this point that I had to reckon with the part of this story that involves my own choices, not just my mother's. Because when I finally sat with everything, the group chat, the deposit, my aunt's comments about the country club crowd, I realized some of what my mother believed about me as father, the assumptions underlying that lowly single mom comment, existed because I had let them exist, years ago, when correcting the record would have cost me more emotional energy than I had to spare in the rawest part of my grief. My mother's cruelty was real. It was also, in part, built on top of a misunderstanding I could have cleared up years earlier and chose, for my own reasons, not to. That's not comfortable to say out loud, but I think it's true, and I think leaving it out would make this story less honest than it needs to be. I found out something else about my cousin Ashley, the one who'd first told me about the separate group chat, that added its own layer of complexity to who was actually helping me and why. It turned out Ashley had her own long-standing grievance against that same country club social circle my mother was so eager to impress, having been passed over for a bridesmaid position years earlier by a woman in that exact friend group, a slight she'd apparently never fully let go of. I don't say this to diminish what she told me, which was true and mattered regardless of her motives. I say it because I think it's worth acknowledging that even the people helping you in moments like these often have their own complicated reasons for doing so, and that doesn't make their help less real, just less simple than it first appears. I drafted a long, furious text to my mother 3 separate times over the following days, and deleted all 3 without sending any of them. Part of me genuinely considered simply saying nothing at all, quietly not attending the party, letting the whole thing pass in silence the way I'd let so many smaller versions of the same dynamic pass over the years. What changed that, finally, was Mia asking me one afternoon, completely unprompted, while we were folding laundry together, whether we were in trouble with Grandma. I realized, hearing that question, that my silence wasn't actually neutral. It was its own kind of message, one I was accidentally teaching my daughter to read as normal, the quiet erasure of hard feelings in favor of surface-level peace. I decided, right there, folding a small t-shirt covered in cartoon dinosaurs, that I wasn't going to let that be the lesson. But I didn't confront my mother directly, not at first, and honestly, not in the way I think she expected once things eventually unraveled. Instead, I did something much quieter, and in hindsight, much more effective. I informed my manager, professionally, without going into personal detail, that I had a personal conflict of interest with an upcoming reservation under my review, and asked to be walked through our standard procedure for handling exactly that kind of situation. It's a normal, unremarkable part of hospitality work. Conflicts of interest come up more often than people realize, and my manager, without asking a single probing question, simply triggered our internal review process, which required reconfirming the client's identity and event details directly with the person who'd made the booking, standard procedure whenever staff conflict is flagged, regardless of how minor. That review is what actually set everything in motion, not any dramatic phone call from me. Because the deposit had technically been paid using my father's card, but flagged under my own professional visibility into the account, the review required my mother to personally reconfirm the booking details directly with the restaurant, something she hadn't anticipated needing to do at all. The restaurant manager on duty that day, a woman named Priscilla, who has absolutely no idea what she was actually stepping into, mentioned to my mother, entirely innocently, while confirming the final head count, something along the lines of, "Oh, Dana's mom's party, right. We just want to make sure everything's set for the big day." My mother, according to what I pieced together afterward from my father, who heard the tail end of it secondhand, went completely quiet on the phone for a long moment before asking, carefully, how Priscilla knew that detail. Priscilla, having no idea she'd said anything remarkable at all, simply explained, cheerfully, that I worked for the regional office, and had flagged the reservation during a routine review, adding something about what a small world it was that we happened to be related. That's how my mother found out, not from me, not through some dramatic confrontation I'd staged, but through an entirely accidental collision between 2 separate parts of my life that had never been meant to intersect at all. She learned, in that moment, that I'd had visibility into her party planning the entire time, that the exclusion she'd engineered so carefully had been sitting, unknowingly, right inside a system I had professional access to review. I imagine, though I wasn't there to see it, that it must have been a genuinely disorienting few seconds for her, realizing the careful separation she'd built between her 2 lives, the family she wanted to show off and the family she wanted to hide, had simply collapsed on its own, without a single word from me. My father, once he understood the full picture, the country club anxiety, the group chat, Mia's overheard phone call and quiet question, did something that genuinely surprised me. He called my mother directly, not me first, and told her, plainly, that he was no longer comfortable funding a party built around excluding his own granddaughter, and that he'd rather redirect that portion of the money towards something Mia could actually be part of. I don't know exactly how that conversation went, since I wasn't on the call, but my mother called me less than an hour later, her voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from her, offering, somewhat hurriedly, to have Mia and me at the party after all. Of course you're invited. There was clearly some kind of miscommunication, she said, her voice pitched slightly too bright, the way people sound when they're performing calm rather than feeling it. I don't know where you even got that message, but it certainly wasn't meant the way it sounds. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, though every part of me wanted to read the message back to her word for word right then. When she was done, I simply said, "I saw the message, Mom. I know exactly what it said and exactly who it was about." There was a pause on her end, longer this time, and when she spoke again, some of the brightness had drained out of her voice. "I just didn't want to make things complicated with people who don't really know our situation," she said, which I noticed wasn't actually an apology, just a slightly softer restating of the original excuse. I declined, calmly, and I want to explain exactly why, because I think it matters more than the decision itself. It wasn't spite. It wasn't an attempt to punish her by staying away. It was the simple, clear-eyed recognition that the invitation, arriving only after the situation had become impossible to hide, wasn't actually about wanting Mia and me there. It was about managing an appearance that had collapsed faster and more publicly than she'd planned for. I told her, gently, that I appreciated the offer, and that we'd be doing something else that day instead. What we actually did instead is the part of this story I'm proudest of. Using the money my father redirected, I planned a small, quiet celebration of my own, timed around an achievement Mia had actually earned that same month, finishing first in her age group at a school science fair she'd worked on for weeks, an accomplishment that had gone almost entirely unacknowledged by my extended family in the noise of the birthday planning drama. We invited a small handful of people, my father, my Aunt Denise, two of my closest friends, who have shown up for both of us consistently over the years, and Ashley, who I've grown closer to since all of this started. It wasn't a big party. It didn't need to be. Mia wore a paper crown she'd made herself out of construction paper and glitter glue, insisting it counted as formal enough, and we ate pizza in my backyard under a string of lights I'd bought on a whim the week before, the same kind of lights I'd noticed and admired at my mother's venue weeks earlier without ever being invited to actually stand under them. My father brought a small gift for Mia, wrapped carefully, unlike some of the gifts she'd received from that side of the family over the years, a telescope, because she'd mentioned once, months ago, wanting to look at the moon properly, a detail he'd apparently remembered and held onto. Watching him set it up in the backyard as the sun went down, patiently explaining the eyepiece to her while she peppered him with questions, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than I'd realized. My mother's party happened on the same day, a few miles away, noticeably smaller, from what I later heard, than she'd originally planned, several people having quietly declined once word of the situation made its way, informally, through the same family channels that had once excluded me. I don't take particular satisfaction in that. I don't wish my mother a lonely birthday. I simply chose, finally, after 8 years of quietly absorbing her version of who my family was supposed to be, to invest my own energy, and my daughter's remaining childhood into the people who have actually, consistently shown up for both of us. I still think about that text sometimes, the one I was never supposed to see. Lowly single mom. I don't think about it with the same sharp hurt anymore, most days. I think about it as the moment I finally stopped editing my own story to make other people comfortable, and started telling Mia, in small, consistent ways, exactly who we actually are, instead of who other people have decided to believe we are. That's my story. One message I wasn't meant to see, one accidental workplace collision that unraveled a carefully managed appearance, and one small backyard birthday party, with a paper crown, that meant more to me than anything my mother's country club friends could have offered either of us. If this reminded you that you don't owe anyone your silence just to keep the peace, take that as your sign today. Correct the story, even years later, even when it's uncomfortable. And if this reminded you of someone in your own life, send it to them tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe, so the next story finds you when it's ready. And I'll see you in the next one.